According to social media, modern movies, toys, video games, and music generally suck. If that's true, then it's our fault.
This video is a summation of opinion and perspective gained over decades of observation. It is not a statement of fact. The existence of these opinions do not negate yours. Disagree if you will, and remember, you are not under attack.
Humans crave comfort and safety. The safer and more comfortable we feel, the more content we feel. Nearly a quarter of the century having passed, we are culturally at the highest level of comfort and safety on a personal level we have ever been. Between that and the rise of social media, siloing and echo chambering is more common than ever. Any opposing idea, opinion, or fact-checking tends to be met with swift disdain, ridicule, and even hate. Outside of politics, that is most prevalent in the communities surrounding pop culture and gaming, especially new entries and legacy franchises. Marvel, DC, Star Wars, Star Trek, Rambo, Terminator, Masters of the Universe, Creed, Hellraiser, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, you get the point, are all under heavy scrutiny from the old guard of fans that brought these franchises to the mainstream through sheer demand of willpower. When character origins are altered, changing a sequence of events, a character's name, costume, abilities, ethnic background, or gender, a group of so-called fans always seem to rise up to express disdain for the apparent false idols.
You know, your faith, do whatever you got to do to get by, right? Jesus, Buddha, Allah, Yahweh, the Marvel universe, I think, works for some people. It's a very popular belief system. They claim that it isn't, but I think it kind of is, because I've poked at the Marvel universe fans, and they react like religious fanatics.
Often resulting in insults, harassment, and even death threats. Expressing loyalty to a brand or franchise is seldom reciprocated, despite many notable moments of perceived fan service. And yet, fans see newer entries as objectively bad because they deviate from the lore or style of the legacy version of the franchise and are more often than not perceived as a rage-inducing betrayal. A dissenting opinion is one thing. Denouncing others for having an opposing opinion or threatening those who worked on these properties is something else entirely. Before I go any further, let me make one thing absolutely clear. There is still such a thing as an objectively bad film, game, album, comic, or show. The feeling of being entertained, however, is purely subjective. Those of us that grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are either well into or fast approaching middle age. We are no longer the target demographic for mainstream pop culture. The exception here seems to be the toys based on our iconic mythos from our childhood and adolescence. Yet we find plenty to complain about there too. With all of the current offerings of the aforementioned properties, I think it's safe to say that these aren't really made for us anymore.
It's not about you.
The MCU and the newly minted DCU are here to do for younger people what comic books did for us, as surely as the slew of remakes and reboots are meant to achieve for them too. In case you haven't noticed, screaming phrases like "not my superheroes" or "woke BS" are bouncing off these companies like bullets off of Superman's chest. For all of the vitriol spewed at Marvel, DC, and the like about how the current offerings are not what we older fans want, it seems perfectly normal for music to continue to adapt with the changing times. Why the double standard? From my perspective, it's as simple as this. We're the first generation to see this kind of representation of our fandom come to life, and we feel more than a little bit of ownership over it. Whereas with music, it's been around since long before our time, and each generation just has its own sound, so we accept that. I like the MCU and much of the former DCEU for what it is, and I recognize that the comics I grew up on will never truly be on the big screen in my lifetime. It's the same for me with the music I grew up on when compared to much of what exists today. Many others, however, do not seem content with such a distinction and want things to change. Well, as sorry as I am to be the one to say this, it just isn't. You can give me all the examples you want, from the Snyderverse to Sonic or Green Lantern's altered CGI, But the fact is that these properties still aren't ours anymore. They're for the next generation. And guess what? They're probably going to go through the same thing in a decade or so. This is the new cycle of generational gaps in pulp culture. We were used to it with TV, film, and music before, and now we can add comic book films and video games to that. Our generations pioneered these new frontiers of consumerism, and it's time to pass the torch. Let me explain why. The creative industries we're talking about here cater to more than nerd culture in general. I've mentioned many genres of film here, and they are retreading so many ideas it's embarrassing. The more we, as the older generation, clamor for nostalgic bliss, whether that's the intent of the outrage or not, the more they will try to give it to us and miss the mark every time. We often say we want new stories, new ideas, and yet this battle over the largest market share of ideas tells a different tale. If we let go of the stuff we grew up with and stay focused on asking for truly new stories and ideas, maybe some good ideas will finally get through. And maybe, just maybe, some of the stuff people seem to be the most upset about might get the attention it deserves. Think about it. Superhero films in general seem to be in a sort of free fall when compared to where they were 10, 15 years ago. And largely, I think that has a lot of hubris attached to it, as well as fan expectation. Not everything can be Captain America, Iron Man, Batman, or Superman. Just like with the comics that gave birth to these characters, some of them will be more popular than others. And I think Disney and Warner Brothers don't quite yet understand how to handle that. And what I mean by all that is pretty direct. We need to stop getting so angry and pissed off and butthurt about this stuff. Yes, there's going to be some stuff that's not as good as what we want it to be. Some stuff's going to be totally different, and that's just going to have to be fine, because they're making it for somebody else. And if those generations don't show up in droves, they're going to move on to something else. And that's okay, because maybe the entire industry needs a soft reboot, so we can get new kinds of films, new kinds of stories, and by proxy, better comic book films and stories moving forward. I wish I could say the same about music, but every genre I can think of is pretty much alive and thriving that existed in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. The problem is there's just a lot of people in those genres that suck. And as a musician, let me tell you, there's no getting around that. With video games, I think we need to double down and rail against this digital-only market that they're creating. Really push back for physical media in different ways, because obviously showing up at retail wasn't working. We also need to disavow live games as a service as the mainstay of things that we're doing, and really push back for more and more storytelling. The problem is that being able to make these things and keep them as profitable as they once were isn't as easy. So while we have to let go of our nostalgic past, I think the corporations need to let go of some of the profit margins they've been used to for a long time. So I'm not blaming fans here, guys. I'm simply saying we need to be part of the solution rather than the problem. Let go of the past, look at the present, and help craft a better future. Now, it's just an idea, right? What do I know? I'm a 46-year-old grindhead that loves all these things, and I just want to see them continue to thrive and improve, but I also want my fellow fans to be happy too. But just remember, all these things that we grew up loving, at one point, they were just someone's idea too. Special thanks to our patrons and members who you're seeing on the screen now. Thank you so much for your support. It really helps.